Ready, set, go.
Okay.
All right. Well,
Ready to for the show, 3 to get ready.
and forward, here we go.
Right.
So we're here for another Sunday afternoon, and I hope everybody's doing well. If you've had your TV on for a second or for the news, you know it's, and we just all know this because we lived through it, and it's today's 9/11. And we know. I think one of the things I think about today is probably something that we all. Well, I don't know about if the young one over here thinks about, but we all probably remember exactly where we were when Kennedy was shot.
Yep.
Even though I was a young kid, yeah, I know you were a really young kid too.
I was 6 months old,
Yeah,
5
see,
months old.
so there you go. But we remember where we were when Kennedy was shot. Well, I remember exactly where I was when I heard about the 9/11 attack.
Me too.
And I think it's, you know what, the thing I was thinking about is, even I was preparing this and been thinking about all day, is how much life has changed since 9/11, and how much what we accept today as normal wasn't normal 20 years ago. It really wasn't. Things have changed. The way you go to the airport, the way that you do things. There's so much in life that has changed because of what happened at 9/11. And it was really truly the first time in our country that we were attacked from the outside, and it brought that depravity, it brought that terror to our country. And it's, it's changed much of the way we do things. And today people are commemorating 9/11. I get that. Many are praying, many are mourning. Our prayers, our thoughts, I hope, are including families that are still suffering from those who were lost, and for our nation, and for those who served and had to put the pieces back together. But more importantly than anything, we need to pray, because this is a theme that I can continue to see that continues to just seem to pop up in front of me lately, is that we need to this nation needs to turn back to the Lord. We need to pray for His guidance and His continued protection, and we need to express gratitude for where we are today and for His love for us. So I don't know. I know we're wrapping up the day. We're coming to the end of it, but maybe as you end your day, include those things in your prayers.
Also about on the TV is the Queen.
Yes, the Queen passing away. That's the big thing, and it's really coming out publicly. Her devotion to her faith, her devotion to Jesus Christ, and what a rock she was. Yeah. That's another family, another public family that needs a lot of healing.
I just heard on the TV just before I came is that there's a lot of these countries that have been, I don't know what they've been called, like Jamaica was part of the whatever. They're all thinking of pulling away now.
Oh,
The
wow.
Commonwealth, they're part of the Commonwealth.
Commonwealth, yes.
Most of them have already closed.
Well, it's going to be, it's more change in the world. That's the one thing that you can count on, is there's going to be change. And so we get to just see what God has in that. That's the way I'm looking at it. God, what do you have in this, and how are we going to live it? So I don't know if you noticed or not, but I'm wearing a different pair of glasses. I broke my glasses this week. Oh boy, and getting prepared for a sermon, I had to, I'll have to get new ones eventually, but I had to crack out an old pair. And the interesting thing is there's a lesson everywhere you want to look. And this, actually, I broke my glasses. It happened to parallel a conversation that Jenny and I were having, because I was talking about, where we were going to head, and some ideas and things like that. And we just finished that journey through Colossians, and for me it was a real exciting journey. I hope it was for you too. I'm not typically, when I preach, when we do sermons, I don't go passage by passage or section by section through a book in the Bible. I find myself to lean more toward topical things or series things, and see where they go. But I just really felt that this is, when we started Colossians, this is where the Lord was leading. And I was very encouraged by the end of it. I was very, very positive. But I was talking to Jenny about, next steps and trying to figure things out and everything else. And she said something to me that had probably been stirring in me, and I think it's stirring in a lot of people. And she just put words to it. And she said, I think that there are things we need to see that will make us refocus. We need to remember that there are people out there that need to see real love and real truth. And I really agree with those words. And for me, refocusing was putting back on an old pair of glasses that is making me constantly refocus. I gotta readjust. It's not that they're way off from my other prescription, but it's causing me to work to have clear vision. And that was a lesson for me. And I brought this up. I kind of brought up this light story to open the door to where we're heading, the journey that we're going to be taking over the next few weeks. I'm excited about it, and I'm just looking forward to seeing how the Lord unpacks it for all of us. I'm sure you guys have even heard me say this, I've often said one day I'm going to preach the greatest sermon ever preached. And that's been my goal. I think it's time to embark on that journey. I think that's where we're headed. Now, we're not going to be using Rick's words. That's the really cool thing about this. For the next few weeks, for the next however long it takes for us to be here, we're going to be in the Sermon on the Mount. Looking at Jesus' words, which I really believe that he preached a lot of things. He taught a lot of things, but he preached two very powerful sermons. And I think that the Sermon on the Mount was one, and the Olivet Discourse was the other. But we are going to, I'm really bringing this up to say, we're going to refocus on the words of Jesus. We're going to refocus on what he had to say and how we can apply it to our lives. Now, before we just jump right into this sermon, I want to give you just a little background. I'm doing a little bit of historical teaching here, maybe clarifying is a better word. Each gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, was all the word is inspired by the Holy Spirit, but it's written by different men. There's 40 different authors of the Bible. Okay, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all written by different people. They all had a connection in one way or another to Jesus or to a disciple of or apostle of Jesus. And so they're written by men, but they're written to a different audience to try and communicate the words of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, in a way that the people that they were writing to would understand. Matthew wrote to the Jews and to the deeply religious. That's why a lot of the Gospel of Matthew is deeply theological, and it's explained in context with Jewish theology. Mark wrote to the Romans. Romans were with the church in Rome, the people in Rome, all of that action-packed. They're looking for something. They just, boom, want to have something. And Mark's gospel is a very action-packed gospel. There's here you encounter Jesus, and boom, something else happens right away. I think that's the speaker. You might need to turn it off. That little beeping?
I thought it was off.
Well, I don't know if it is or isn't. Anyway, Luke was a Greek. He was a physician. He was a Greek, and he wrote to other Greeks. John wrote to everyone. John was just trying to communicate in a different way than Matthew, Mark, and Luke had written, because their gospels were written prior to John's gospel. John's gospel was the last one that was written, but it was written to the church in general, to people in general, to understand who Jesus was, to understand the life and ministry of Jesus. So whether it's liturgical like Matthew's or action-packed like Mark's, or for deep thinkers, it's the message of grace, the words of Jesus were recorded so people could understand them. Now, if you're like me, or at least like me where I was, as I've been in the past, especially when I was younger, and you're reading the Gospels, you're reading through the New Testament, you jump up on the Sermon on the Mount and you're thinking linearly like I think, well, the Sermon on the Mount had to be one of the first things that happened in Jesus' ministry. Not so. Not so, young Padawan. I'm going to tell you a little different. Matthew records it near the beginning of his gospel, and that makes us think that way. Luke records it very similarly, close to the beginning of the gospel. But the ministry of Jesus, it began, as we all know, with his baptism. John 1 tells that, Matthew 3 tells us that, Luke 2 tells us that, Luke 3 tells us that. On and on and on it tells us that the ministry of Jesus began with his baptism. What followed was 40 days in the desert. Okay, we know that. He was prayer and fasting, being tempted by Satan and everything else. The first recorded miracle in John 2, this is the first miracle that Jesus performed publicly, was the turning the water into wine at the wedding feast in Cana. And after that and between the time that he sits down to preach this sermon, he meets, but doesn't call, he meets several of the men that would eventually be his disciples. He performs many miracles. He teaches and is chased out of several synagogues, several cities, and all this has happened all prior to the Sermon on the Mount. He also had encounters that we don't correlate with this. Before the Sermon on the Mount, he met and encountered the woman at the well in Samaria. We don't think of it that way. We think that this is something that happened afterwards, because people were following Jesus, and it says these people ran off to feed Jesus. We're thinking it was his disciples. It was just the people that were following him. He had this encounter. Also, what is something that happened that I think that we see out of order is this: Jesus had attended or went to synagogue on the first Passover, and at the first Passover is when he cleansed the temple. Now, most people think that happened right before his crucifixion. Most people, because of the way they read the Gospels, think that was one of the last things that he did. But that's not so. It was at the very first Passover. This was one of the other things that set him at odds with the Jews, with the Jewish leaders, was because he was doing these things. He'd been ministering before the Sermon on the Mount for over a year. He'd been healing people and doing all kinds of things and garnered a lot of attention and attracted a lot of crowds. And he was ridiculed and criticized. He said things like a prophet doesn't have, any respect in his own country, because he was chased out of Nazareth. He was chased out of Galilee. He was ridiculed and criticized. We come up to the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm giving you this quick little snippet to tell you. By this time, he started to gather this group of people, this group of men that he knew that he was going to invest in, that were going to be the ones to launch this church. They were going to be the ones. They had kind of come clear. He'd met Andrew and Simon. He'd met Philip and Nathaniel, and they had been disciples or followers of John the Baptist, and they had begun to follow Jesus. And I'm just telling you all this to say, you know what? Sometimes our viewpoint, our perspective needs a little adjustment. It's not because we're trying to get the wrong information or anything else. Sometimes it's just because of an inaccurate understanding or things that weren't really clarified in the teaching. And I say this to say this is another reason to step back and refocus, which is what we are going to be doing. When we understand a little more about the chronology of the life and ministry of Jesus, we understand the lessons better that he taught, and they make a little bit more sense. See, we're doing the best to follow what Paul said, doing the best to live and understand. Where Paul told Timothy, he says, do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. And that's our journey, is to do that. What we get to do is to learn and to live the words of Jesus. That's a big task, but there's big rewards. So we're going to jump into this message, and I'm going to pick it apart for you as best I can do, and hopefully we'll be encouraged. Hopefully it'll clarify some things. Now, the Sermon on the Mount is recorded in Matthew 5 through 7 in detail, and also in Luke 6. We're going to be spending most of our time in Matthew. And I'm going to read the first part of it to you, because you've heard this and you've heard this, and then we'll just talk about it. Starting in chapter 5, verse 1. When he saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain. After he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the humble, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. You are blessed when they insult you and persecute you and falsely say every kind of evil against you because of me. Be glad and rejoice, because your reward is great in heaven. For that is how they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now, this lesson, these Beatitudes, went completely contrary to what was being taught. What was being taught in the day. It not only goes against kind of our nature, but it goes against what the religious leaders were teaching. The scribes and the Pharisees, the rabbis of the day, would teach you that that righteousness, that the correct behavior was an external matter. In other words, it was that how well you adhered to the rules and the regulations that we placed. It had nothing to do with heart. It had to do with your adherence, your appearance. Jesus said something different. But I want you to take note, because we're going to get into what he said. I want you to take note. Who was he talking to? Who was he really talking to? We think so many people, and this again was a picture that was painted for me when I first started to learn about the Sermon on the Mount, that he was on the mountain speaking to the crowds. Not so. Not so. He went up the mountain to get away from the crowds. And he called his disciples to him. Now, if you are like me and you know human nature, the disciples are going to come, and there are going to be people in the group that are going to say, hey, wait, what about me? I'm going too. So he was speaking to more than the disciples, but the message was directed at those that he was going to task, that he was going to build into about being the church, and about living and being the church and forming this church. This revelation, starting with his Beatitudes, wasn't about rules and regulations. It was about how to do life as a believer. See, as believers, truth is, we're different. As believers, we adhere to a different standard. You've seen the Hebrew National commercial, right? We answer to a higher source. You know, that whole thing. We adhere to a different standard, and Jesus was establishing the standard right from the start. He didn't start off this sermon with a story or a joke to grab their attention. I've been through so many classes about preaching and things like that, and they give you this is the formula you have to preach. And you start off with a joke, you start off with a story. You got to grab their attention, and then you got to tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you've got to teach them, and then you've got to remind them what you told them. And that's not what Jesus did. He came right from the start, and he was going to speak truth and wisdom. He was showing the way to a life that was filled with peace, purpose, and passion. And this goes against what culture would teach you. This goes against what society was saying at this time, and what society would teach you today. He spoke to all who was listening. He was speaking to the disciples, but there were many others that were listening. And he spoke in a way that they would understand, that they would comprehend this. Now, one more thing before we get into the 8 Beatitudes, because I'm going to unpack them real quick for you. The term blessed. How many of you are like me? Are you worn out on the term blessed? You love that Christian jargon? Oh, how are you doing? Oh, I'm so blessed. And people look at you like, what are you talking about? They don't understand that. And people that use that, I don't believe really understand what it means. I mean, they're trying to say that, what God's shining on them and they're special and those kind of things, and God's there to do something beneficial in their lives. And that's not what Jesus is saying here. Some translations say happy, and that doesn't do any more to help us understand what he was really saying. He's talking about a spiritual condition here. He's talking about spiritual contentment and understanding. Life is going to make more sense. You are going to be spiritually satisfied. You're going to be content. You are going to have that inner peace that people are looking for if you understand what's going on. See, a life that's marked by focus and contentment of the Lord is a life that is peaceful and joy-filled. See, the true servant of God, and I read this, the true servant of God is blessed regardless of circumstances, because God has favored them with a fully satisfied soul. That's from Psalm 63. Okay, so people are looking at things and saying, I'm so blessed, I'm so favored, and they're missing the message of Jesus. We need to understand that he's talking again about spiritual these, and then that exudes out of us, as we will find the next lessons teach. So let's take these characteristics apart, these traits apart. First one he says is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. This isn't about being happy because you're poor. So many people misinterpret, I must be, I must be happy, God must be favoring me because I'm so poor. That's not what it is. What he's saying is, what Jesus is really teaching the disciples is, if you're poor in spirit, you're recognizing that you have a need. You're recognizing that you have a need that you can't meet, that you're spiritually destitute without Christ in your life. And when you understand that you have nothing because you don't have him, then you're going to seek him. And that's where you're going to find that contentment. That's where you're going to find the results of heaven. He goes on to say, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Well, what are you mourning? Wouldn't you ask that? What are they mourning? They're mourning their inability to meet their need. They're mourning their depravity, their lostness, their sinfulness. And if you understand that, if you're grieved because God, I know some real Christians that get stuck here because they see themselves as less because they've had such a hard life. And they feel like they've made so many mistakes, and so they stay in this constant state of mourning because they're looking for that comfort, instead of understanding that we've been forgiven and we've been favored by the Lord, and he has more than us. We recognize the need, we grieve that, we mourn it, and then it's time to say, God, I understand that you're comforting me because you've accepted me just as I am. And so I can find hope in that. I can find relief in that. That's the comfort he's talking about. Now he goes on to say, blessed are the humble, for they will inherit the earth. You know what they say? Humility is something that when you have, as soon as you recognize it, you don't have it anymore. Really, being humble, you understand it's not about you. It's not about me. It's not about you either. Being humble, being meek, as it says in some translations, is recognizing that that Jesus has to be at the center, that he's all. It's about him and his glory. And in turn, when we live there, when we understand that humility, then God in his generosity gives us a life that is filled with all the things that we might really want and desire. And that's what it is about inheriting the earth. He says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Well, what is righteousness? You've heard me tell you this and tell you this and tell you this. It's a right standing with the Lord. It's getting your relationship right. It's getting it back in order. And if that's your hunger, if that's your desire, if that's what you want to pursue, if that's the pursuit of your life, you will be satisfied. See, that right relationship with God, when Jesus is at the center, when we're seeing our salvation through to completion, as Paul asked us to, when we recognize that all we have and all we are comes from him, that way leads us to a life of satisfaction, no matter what challenges, what bumps in the road might come up, what comes our way. Now, these first 4 Beatitudes really are internal traits. If you want to see that's what they are. These are internal things. These are more personal things. They're characteristics of somebody who is pursuing intimacy with the Lord. The next 4 Beatitudes are actions that are evident for everybody else to see. So, Jesus goes on to say, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Man, how many times I'm so thankful for the times I've been shown mercy in my life, especially in my relationship with the Lord, but from other people too. That compassion, that benevolence, that kindness, it really makes a difference. And that's what mercy is. Mercy is God's benevolence, to use a big word. It's his compassion, his kindness, his magnanimity toward us. You've heard me say this recently. I've said it a few times. I've told several people this. I don't think many people live with empathy anymore. People are so drawn into themselves, into this me generation, that they can't see that other people are struggling and having problems. So empathy is a thing that leads us to compassion. And those things bring peace and unity in every circumstance. And because we're willing to be merciful, we are going to be shown mercy. It's just like what Jesus said about forgiveness. If you're not willing to forgive somebody who's wronged you, you're not going to be forgiven by your Father. And he told a parable about that, about the servant that owed a little and owed a lot, and his master forgave him, and then he went to not forgive the one who owed him a little, and he ended up getting thrown in jail until he could pay every penny. So mercy is such an important trait, and it's something that needs to be out there for us to just live out. It says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Now, we're going to come to this week on our Wednesday Bible study in the last half of the first chapter of James. And James has something to say about this pure in heart, this what pure religion really is. And we'll talk about it a little more, but this pure in heart is what James is talking about. This is the pure religion that James speaks of. It's not marked by my wants, my needs, my desires, but it's marked by this attitude that, you know what, God, I want to learn and I want to listen to you and then live that way. This pure in heart is something that is God ordained, and it goes through us. And when we strive for that purity, God is revealed in all our steps. He reveals himself to us, and he reveals himself through us. The next beatitude is this, and this is a big one. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. This is a stumbling block for many. This is a stumbling block because people don't want to be a peacemaker. They see if you're being a peacemaker, you're compromising, you're selling out, you're being doing all the wrong things. You're not standing up for you. Well, Isaiah 26:3 says, you will keep the mind that is dependent on you in perfect peace, for it is trusting you. See, being a peacemaker is really about bringing God's presence, who God is, who he is to you, to a circumstance, to a situation. And it really opens the door to unity. Now, I think it's really interesting that Jesus says this, if you're a peacemaker, you're going to be called a son of God. It's because family and unity is so important that, you know what, when families are fighting and families are not in harmony, man, it just feels like the whole family's fractured. Nobody wants to be around each other. Nobody wants to be around one another. But that peacemaker, that one that can bring peace and perspective to the circumstance, that's all the difference in the world. See, there is strength in being a peacemaker. There is understanding in bringing maybe another view to the circumstance of the situation. And really what it does is it enhances and reinforces and allows the family to refocus on what's really important. Being a peacemaker is important, especially today more than ever. There's so many things and there's so much. Our culture is fractured. And it's fractured because people are screaming and they want to fight instead of sitting down and listening to one another. Instead of sitting down and having real conversations and saying, let's find a way. Let's find a way. And instead we'd rather yell and scream and demand, and then people look at that and they step back, and then if there's a mistake made, that mistake gets all blown out of proportion. You know, and so this is something that's so important. The last parable, and it's really, the last beatitude. So people will debate whether there's 8 or 9 beatitudes because they take this last one that's in verse 10 and they think that verse 11 and 12, which is just an explanation of verse 10 really, or a reinforcement of verse 10, is another beatitude. This is the beatitude. He says, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Now let me be really, really clear here. Jesus is saying something to his disciples and to those that were listening, but he's really telling disciples something contrary to the world's way. These things, while they look good, or where they sound good, are not what the world would tell you. The world will tell you, fight for what's yours. Only give mercy if you've gotten mercy. Don't be a peacemaker. Do it your way. That's what the world would tell you. See, but Jesus is telling you that this is a path that's wrapped up in love and compassion. And because of that, you're going to be judged. You're going to be criticized. Jesus lived this for 3.5 years, and he was judged and criticized. He was sought after to be destroyed. You see? And because of, if we're going to be Christ followers and we're going to try and live this way, we're going to be at odds. As I heard a pastor say today, we're going to be weird in the eyes of the world. We really are. See, the world says me first. But believers want to get this relationship right. And then they want to get these relationships right. And then that reflects on who we are. So, because we get this relationship right and we find forgiveness, we find love, we find acceptance, we can live with mercy, we can live with empathy, we can live with all those things. But because of that too, there are things that are going to happen to us. You're going to be criticized for your faith. You're going to be ostracized from your family. And that's what Jesus said down the road when he says, I didn't come to unite, I come to divide, because people aren't going to understand the stand you're taking. But the last thing Jesus said, one of the last things he said to his disciples and to those that were listening was, take heart, because I've overcome the world. And we need to understand that. See, this all falls together when we begin to understand the time frame of this. It makes a difference. Now, I've just jumped in just briefly and just tried to touch on these things. If you wanted to go in depth on every one of these traits, you could spend just so much time into all this. But what I really saw as I read this again and again, and as I've studied this over and over, is that Jesus was building. He was building people up. He was building on one characteristic after the other. You're poor in spirit. You know what? You need, you're going to get heaven once you recognize you're poor in spirit and you seek forgiveness. You're mourning. You're going to seek comfort. That brokenness that comes is going to eventually be mended, because this path is leading us toward heaven. You know what? When you understand it's not about you and it's about God, wow, it opens the door to everything else. And we could go on and on. You see, but what Jesus was really doing, and the foundation he was laying in this message, was totally a disruption of what the disciples would have seen as norm. And if he really came to this world today and sat down at Red Hill Park in the amphitheater and just preached this to people who were listening, it would be go against what we see as culturally normal. But here's the thing. Jesus he says that we take these words, and sometimes they're used as a stick, and they shouldn't be. See, Jesus wasn't being judgmental or critical. He was saying, I'm trying to show you a different way. I'm showing you a different way. And the people, many of the people that were listening to him were searching for that way. Think about it. The ones that Jesus criticized, the ones that he tore down, the ones that he picked apart, were the religious know-it-alls that thought that they had the answers and thought that their way was the only way. Those were the ones that had no room for compassion or kindness. All they had room for was judgment and criticism, and they wanted to flaunt their superiority over everybody, especially the broken and the hurting. Jesus came to bring healing and hope to the broken and the hurting. Now, as being a Christ follower, as we understand these, as these traits become part of who we are, we're going to challenge the norms of the day. When people tell you, you need to fight for this, we stand for truth with love and compassion. That doesn't mean that we're unwilling to fight. It just means we understand what truth is, and there's a different way. See, kindness will manifest itself compassion will manifest itself. These characteristics of mercy and peace and everything will manifest itself in a circumstance if we understand that Christ's way is different. And here's the thing, in the storms, one of the things that the disciples marveled with throughout the stories of Jesus, the people marveled with, was that he could speak calm to a storm, right? Well, what are our storms today? Are they hurricanes or typhoons or those things? Yeah, those things happen, but that's not what we're talking about. The storms of today are confusion or stress or disunity or broken. And this way, Jesus' way, speaks calm, brings perspective and peace to those circumstances. See, the actions of mercy, the actions of purity, the actions of righteousness, peace, and understanding will point anybody who's watching to the way, the truth, and the life. And that's what our lives are about. Let's pray. Father, just so grateful for you, for your love, for your words, for your kindness. Thank you that you loved us right where we are, so that we could turn to you and find the answers to many of the questions and the hurts that we have, that you've brought us comfort and healing and hope for each day. Father, may we be those examples. May we learn to live in a way that lets these traits become part of who we are, part of our walk, our existence. And as we realize it's about you, may we honor and glorify you in everything that we say and we do. Let our actions and our words point other people to you in simple ways. Be with us today, even in all that's going on. There's still turmoil in lives. There's still hurt, and there's still people that need hope and healing, even in our family, Father. But your presence, your words, bring peace and perspective to every circumstance. Your way is so different, and we call upon you to just continue to guide us on your path. It really is about his grace. It's his grace first, his grace always. And we get to just live it with simplicity and reality, and we get to live with love. Have a great week. That died.